Dr. Richard Carrier, thank you again. What kind of wine are you drinking?
Oh, it's 19 crimes.
19 crimes. Yeah, well, I appreciate you, of course, taking the time to do the courses and then spend that extra time to talk and ask or answer questions of my Patreon members. And so we'll just get right into it.
Right on.
Joel Pearson, an OG of yours, says Candida Moss's book, The Myth of Persecution, seems to bring a lot of the early Christian narrative into question. Do you think her work is accurate? And do you know whether the critical consensus agrees with her?
Yeah, I think she's done pretty good, solid scholarship. I don't know what the consensus would be regarding that because I've not heard it discussed really, even negatively. So I really don't know what the opinion is. I think certainly mainstream objective scholars kind of already knew the thesis was true that and she's just the first one who wrote a book that said, you know what, this is the case. And for people who don't know what we're talking about, she showed that most Christian persecution narratives are fabricated, and that the whole, certainly the whole current legend of Christian persecution is not true. And that actually has already been kind of mainstream, the idea that persecution was actually sporadic, rarely official, wasn't as extensive as Christians claimed. That's an old mainstream consensus claim. That's not novel. The only thing that Candida Moss added to that was that, yeah, we can't even trust the Christian narratives of martyrdom stories, that those are actually doubtful. And she's right, they are actually doubtful.
Wow. Yeah, I know that even a conservative evangelical, Sean McDowell, who got his PhD and actually said, and he's one that would love, deep down, he would love to say that they're all true.
Yeah, he did say that, particularly because he was dealing with the apologetic of they all died for a lie kind of thing. No one would die for a lie thing. But he researched it. He had to admit, like, we don't really have reliable accounts of the martyrdom of any of the apostles. I mean, even when we have it mentioned, we don't have an account. It's like we don't really know why Paul was killed. Our best information contradicts all the later legends. The best information comes from 1 Clement. It says he died in Spain. It said he died in Spain, witnessing for the faith, but that's really vague. Like, we don't know, like, did he just drop dead? Like, did someone kill him? We don't really know what the story is behind that. And the later narratives of Paul are absolutely ridiculous, fabulous stories that aren't believable at all. And since they contradict the only eyewitness, well, it's not really an eyewitness, but contemporary account tells us that it's false. And that's an example of the kind of thing that Candida Moss is showing, is that, like, when you actually look at the evidence, the mythical tales of martyrdoms are ridiculous and unbelievable. And when you erase all those and look at, like, the credible evidence, the picture of persecution is radically different. And in truth, the Romans only persecuted Christians not for their beliefs, but for illegal assembly. They didn't have licenses to assemble. And even then, most Roman emperors said, leave them alone, right? Like, so it really wasn't an active persecution of Christianity. That only happened in the late 3rd century, when you had the sort of serious pogrom attacks on Christianity. And those didn't last very long because Constantine came along and shut that down. So there is some truth to the martyrdom narratives, but it's a way, way different story than the Christian writing. And this is the thing I pointed out, is that most Christian writing, like the normal mode of ancient Christian writing, is to make stuff up. If you count the number of Gospels, you count the number of epistles, you count the number of Acts, you count the number of other stories that are completely made up, it hugely outweighs anything that you can believe is actually historically accurate or true. So making stuff up is what they normally do. And so for Candida Moss to find that result for martyrdom tales is not a surprise.
A couple of things I loved about her work is going into the term for martyr, which is witness. And this would be something in the courts that gets kind of capitalized on by Christians. That term becomes kind of like a term they use. But the concept that they kind of monopolize the term, the concept of self-sacrifice or sacrificing for the greater good, I loved how she went into some of the ancient Greek stories.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like, this is not, Christians weren't unique in this regard. I mean, the whole idea of martyrdom heroism was already heavily present in Judaism, and was also heavily present in pagan lore too, in pagan history. They had their own martyrs and so forth, and not religious martyrs, like usually political martyrs, right? But it's the same kind of thing, like the same kind of ideology. And the Romans had that idea of the heroism of self-sacrifice. They had the whole idea of the devotio, where like a general would devote himself to a particular god, and in exchange for him running pell-mell into the enemy and getting himself killed on the battlefield, his army would be given victory by God. And this was whether this ever actually happened or not, it was definitely a legendary belief that the Romans held, that you could actually do this, and that it was like heroic to do this. So the idea of sacrificing yourself for something you believe in, that was normal. That wasn't something that the Christians invented.
I think that it's just the coining of the phrase and applying it to Christians.
Right.
And I think that while it's important, I know, to try and say this is Christianizing terms and things like that, I think there's almost, while we get down into the nitty gritty of like, here are terms that are Christianized, as you've heard plenty of scholarship, I'm sure, but they're so much zeroing in and honing in on it with a microscope that they're like missing the bigger picture, that it's like, you can call it Jesusanize and I can call this Dionysize. Okay. The point is, the same kind of theme is occurring here, and whatever the topic is, resurrection, well, that's uniquely Jewish. Okay. And there might be facets about it. I'm just saying, like, the idea of like the general resurrection idea thing.
It's still not Jewish.
Really?
Comes from Persian Zoroastrianism.
General resurrection?
Yeah, even Judaism didn't have it. That's why it doesn't exist in the pre-exilic literature in the Old Testament. There's no resurrection. There's not even really an afterlife belief, really. Like the dead sleep, and then maybe you could summon their ghost for a brief period of time if you had a witch to do it. Like that was their kind of system of belief. After the Persian occupation, and then of course, especially when they were freed somewhat freed, turned into vassals when given a certain amount of freedom by Cyrus the Great under the Persians, then there was a huge influx of Zoroastrian ideas being adopted and integrated into Judaism. And so everything, general resurrection came from Zoroastrianism, apocalypticism came from Zoroastrianism, linear history came from Zoroastrianism, dualism, like there's a god that is fighting an evil force in the world, comes from that. The flaming hell idea comes from Zoroastrianism. So all of this stuff entered Judaism later on, and actually comes from Persian Zoroastrianism, Persian imperial religion. So yeah, even that isn't originally Jewish. The Jews borrowed it.
Okay.
And the same things leak from Zoroastrianism into paganism as well. So there's lots of resurrection stories and mythology as well. It's different. It ends up different in the pagan storyline, but it's there.
I want to hone in then just a little deeper, because 100% you're correct here. As far as general resurrection, I never knew that about the Zoroastrians. But what I figure I would emphasize when I heard John Dominic Crossan trying to explain, when I said, do Christians understand the resurrection of Jesus? And he did this long, like it went 48 minutes. I was shocked it went this long. Yeah. And he wanted to explain two terms. And he said apotheosis, and then he said resurrection. And he says resurrection in Paul is uniquely this Jewish thing, meaning obviously we would know it's borrowed, but that isn't something that Greeks were using, or is it uniquely Jewish in this way, but generally speaking,
it depends on how specific you're getting, right?
Right.
So the thing that's uniquely let's just say the thing that's distinct about Paul versus later Christian authors, and not all later Christian authors, like Origen, the church father of the 3rd century, was totally in line with, I think he really got Paul, and his doctrine of the resurrection agrees with Paul's, and of course it was declared heretical later by the church. So Paul's idea is that it's not possible to be alive without a body, right? So God can preserve the idea of you in his mind or whatever. You can sleep in the grave, but you can't be conscious without a working body. Now, Paul said, like, you discard the old body, the flesh body, the body that decays and is a piece of garbage or whatever, and you would get this new supernatural angelic body, but you still had to have a body. And so that's why resurrection for Paul does require this sort of, it's not like a soul floating up to heaven. It requires your essence to be stamped in a material. And he just argued that it's stamped in a new material and so on. Now, that's not entirely unique to Paul. There are pagan arguments that are similar to that. When you do dig into, so there's various classicists who've gone into the body of the gods, so studying the literature and metaphysics about this. Now, less of this has been preserved because, Christianity is the religion that became dominant. So we have more, right? We have more Christian literature than we have pagan literature about religion, of course. But we have enough hints to be able to reconstruct their view of for example, heroes that live in the paradise, the Isle of the Blessed, or wherever it is, that they also would acquire bodies of the gods. And so there'd be superior bodies, like unbreakable bodies, unaging bodies, and so forth, bodies that don't necessarily need to eat and things like that. And so that idea did exist, but it became more popular among the Greeks. You have this Platonic idea of a disembodied soul, and that comes from classical Greek belief, which is the idea of the shades, that a sort of a ghost of you survives, but it can't enjoy any pleasures because it has no sensation, really. Like, it can't touch anything, it can't enjoy anything. And so when Christians are coming along and preaching resurrection to people who were still buying into the shades idea, then it becomes an attractive idea. But there were already pagan notions of resurrection and survival through a new body that were also competing with Christians in this whole dynamic. And that's what a lot of these mystery cults are about. And that's the thing, like, we have these actual code documents, these little secret scripts, the golden plates that are rolled up and buried with people long ago when they were Dionysians, a Dionysian cult. And it gave them instructions for when they're a shade and they're their Hades, how to find the secret place where you basically get to live a paradisical life rather than a sad life. And those scrolls don't really give us specifics of the metaphysics of how it happened. But if you look at the metaphysics we do have of the discussion of the bodies of the gods and the heroes and things like that, almost certainly it must imply that once you get to this paradise, you get some sort of body that you can enjoy paradise with. Otherwise, it would be a contradiction in their metaphysics, right? We just don't have a lot of the discussion of this. We have more discussion of the Christian things because Christians preserved it.
Thank you.